So we're going to start with a mini quiz. To warm up, because it is a Wednesday morning, it is January, and I don't know if it's the same for you guys, but I have been sluggish starting this year. So we're going to do a covered by FOI or not covered by FOI quiz. I'm going to show you 3 different slides with examples of what could be on an FOI request. On each slide, at least one thing will not be covered by FOI. So let's start simple with the first one. Which of these is not covered by FOI? Data about council spending, proposed educational changes, or information about yourself? I'll give you a minute. You can note down your answer, and then we'll move on to the answer and I can talk about it a bit. Okay, let's move on to the answer. Oh, there we go. So information about yourself is the only one of these that is not covered by FOI. It's covered by something called a subject access request. Instead, we get a lot of people on What Do They Know who come along and ask for information about themselves and have to be told that they have to make the request privately under the subject access request guidelines. So the next one we've got, which of these isn't covered by FOI? Requesting that a councillor gives a new opinion on a proposed development, correspondence via messaging services about missed bin collections, or statistics of reasons for arrests made in September 2023. This is a little bit harder. So which of these do you think is not covered by FOI? I'll give you a second to think about those. Right, so the answers for this one is requesting that a councillor gives a new opinion on a proposed development. So unless the opinion has been recorded, a person's opinion, even a public figure like a councillor, is not subject to FOI. So requesting a new opinion implies it's something that's not already been expressed or written down, which means it would be unrecorded and therefore you can't make an FOI about it. The other two, even messaging services like WhatsApp or Messenger, if they're used for council business, can be requested under FOI. Okay, and let's move on to the last one. There's a bit of a change up here. So which of these is covered by FOI? Environmental information from local authorities about green space redevelopment, data from Serco about provision of accommodation to asylum seekers, or information about private companies wholly owned by a local authority providing social housing services. So which of these is covered by FOI? I'll give you a little bit longer to think about that one. And so this one, it's the information about private companies wholly owned by a local authority providing social housing services. Even though in this one you're asking for information about a private company, because they're owned by a local authority and they're providing a public service, they can be considered similar to a public body in the eyes of FOI law. You might have put number 1 here, which is the environmental information from local authorities. This is actually covered under the environmental information regulations. So that's why that one is not FOI, because environmental information regulations are slightly different. We'll talk about that in a second. How did you all do? You're welcome to post in the chat how you did. Let's just go on to the next one. So let's talk quickly about environmental information regulations. So EIR stands for Environmental Information Regulations, which I have amazing trouble saying quickly in one go. It's similar to FOI, but it specifically covers information to do with the environment. Some authorities are subject only to EIR, for example, port authorities or water companies. So they may be private companies, but they provide a public service, and therefore, in our eyes, they're subject to EIR. The ICO's guidance suggests that it is down to the authority to make the decision whether a request falls under environmental information regulations or FOI. And you don't need to mention EIR or FOI in the request when you make it. They will have to treat it under whichever one it falls under. They may start a response to your request with something that looks like a refusal, and then say that they're treating your request as EIR instead of FOI. There are, of course, exceptions. There are exceptions to everything. There are exceptions which can result in a refusal to give you information. I'm not going to go into these today, but I'm going to send you an email after the seminar with a whole host of information about all the different rejections, exemptions, and refusal reasons and what you can do about them. So yeah, I'll send that after the seminar, and you can have a look at that if you need to. So let's move on to framing our requests. In this section, we're going to talk a little bit about what you need to ask for, and what kind of things we, as mySociety, who run What Do They Know, suggest should be included in an FOI request to get a better response and hopefully a quicker response with less requests for clarifications or rejections. So what information do you need when you're making an FOI request? Really, ideally, you need to figure out what you need to ask for. The first point of call when you're thinking about making an FOI request, especially if it's in a campaigning or advocacy or policy change situation, you kind of want to think about, what are you trying to do with this information? Based on your campaign topic or your policy idea, what information do you actually need? And how are you going to use that information to push forward your campaign or your policy idea? Is it, for example, research? So is it underpinning everything that you're going to be doing? So do you need those base level statistics? If that's the case, what are you going to ask for? How long is that time period going to be? Or are you going to use it as part of your campaign? Are you looking for something which you can use as a big headline number? In that case, do you want to make a really specific, very time boxed, very like, I'll say specific again because I can't think of a better word, very specific request that is just asking for like one small piece of information that you can use as your headline piece in a campaign. And of the information you need to think about what is recorded in information. So like we saw in the quiz, the only information that you can ask for via FOI is recorded information. So you can't ask for something that is not recorded. You can't ask for new opinions. You can't ask for things that like might have been said in passing to you, but were never written down, for example. And as well as things like documents and emails, recorded information does also cover things like videos, photographs, audio recordings, like I said, messages using messenger services, like WhatsApp and all this kind of thing. So you can ask for quite a breadth of information in that recorded information point. You need to also think about who might hold the information you need. It might not be the first authority that you think of. So for example, you might be looking for a certain type of information about food lobbying, for example. And you might think, oh, I need to go to the Department of Health or something like that. But actually, if it's about meals provided to school children, that would be covered under the local authority that you're looking at, or all the local authorities if you're looking at a nationwide kind of thing. So it might not always be the first authority that you think of that holds the information that you need. So really have a good idea of what that information is so that you can start digging into where does that information sit, where does it come from, and which authority might be holding it, and who can I ask for that information. And then the most important thing that we always say is, what time period do you need that information for? It's really, really important to have a well-defined time period, because this means there's a better chance of getting information released. If you don't define your time period, then the authority might assume you mean all time. And then suddenly what you thought was a small request becomes massive to them. They have to search through all of their records since they started keeping records to find this information for you and provide it for every year that they have this information recorded. And though that sounds like it might be a great thing, that's likely to hit a cost exemption. So it's really, really good to know, like, okay, I'm doing a campaign about provision of healthy food to children in schools. I need to ask local authorities for the school year 2022 to 2023, how much fruit they gave to each school child, for example, in that particular school year. So you've defined a time, and then you could also define it even further by saying, like, just in year 1 and year 2, or just in reception, so that they're not trying to find too much information for you, which will mean that they reject it. And finally, if you know anything about the information to begin with, that's super useful as well. So for example, if you're looking for details of trafficked people, and you know that they record, like the Home Office records the details of trafficked people by their country of origin, then you can specifically ask, I want details of people who come from, like, trafficked people who come from this country, this country, this country. So it narrows down the amount of information that they have to look for, because if you don't know that information, it could be, again, be a really wide data set that they're looking at, and then it could end up hitting the cost exemption. You don't always need to know this. If you don't know any information about it, it's not a deal breaker. But if you do know it, it can be really useful to you. So let's have a quick look at some request examples and some comparisons. So basically, everything I've just talked through, we're going to see how it works in practice. I'm going to show you a couple of requests where there's been an ask for clarification, and one where there's been no ask for clarification, or the information has been released relatively quickly. There'll be 3 sets of requests, and I'll show you the comparisons and exactly what we're looking at. So let's jump right into that. So right now we're going to look at the specific time frame. Move the zoom thing. Oh no, I can't. That's annoying. That's gone forward too fast. Sorry. So we're looking at. I'm really sorry. This is going forward too fast. Specific time frame versus a non-specific time frame. Just got a peek of what was going to be ahead. So an example of this is over the past 3 years, which you might think is a specific time frame. You might think, well, I've specified, I just want it for the past 3 years. But then an FOI officer who receives that over the past 3 years FOI request will then think, like, well, we define years in different ways. So do you mean financial year? Do you mean calendar year? Do you mean school year? Do you mean some other kind of year? So then they have to ask you for a clarification of what you're thinking, because they don't know what's in your head. So in practice, this looks like, on the left-hand side of the screen, I think that'll be the left-hand side of the screen for you. So the one that's outlined in yellow, you'll see that Helen here has made a request to the National Lottery Community Fund. She has specified here that she's asking for information by financial year, and you can see underneath that the response she's got is relatively immediate. It says, you've requested the following information. And what you can't see underneath is that they've attached an HTML document which has given her the information. They haven't asked for any clarifications. They've just released the information because she's been really clear about what time period she wants and what she actually wants the information for. Whereas Rachel on this side has asked for information for the last 3 years. And she's been really clear about like the type of information she wants. She's talked about, you know, specific benefits and also how they can break down the information that she's asking for. But unfortunately, the NHS have come back and said, could you clarify if you require the information per financial year? And underneath, what you can't actually see is like they're asking, do you need it per calendar year? What other kind of years might you be talking about? Because we don't know how you want this information provided. So therefore, we can't answer your question until we know this. And that just, it delays things for you a little bit. So the next one is use of specific terminology for requests versus terminology that isn't easily searchable for the FOI officers. So a second. So terminology can be used to narrow down a request. And we'll see this as an example here. Sorry, it's going by too fast. So an example of this is that we might think is it's quite easy to understand terminology, but might not be for a local council, is something like local disabled parking spaces. That's not the way the information would be recorded for a local authority. And what they would be thinking is like, do you mean local to you? Do you mean local to us? Like, where is local for you? We don't understand that definition. And also we don't record disabled parking spaces by this, we record them by road. So an FOI officer might then ask, like, can you specify what you mean by local? Can you include a postcode in road or area name? And then can you include like what you mean by local in terms of distance from an area? So there's like something that we might understand internally as to mean something to us isn't necessarily something that a local authority would be able to search for. And so what I mean by this in practice is you can see here, Mr. Cross has made a request here, which is asked for voluntary contributions to the Exchequer. And then he said underneath, this should be interpreted as referring to, and then given 3 particular items that he's looking for in this FOI request, and then also defines something that he doesn't want it referred to. So not voluntary national insurance contributions. It's not information he's interested in. So he's defined the term he means by voluntary contributions. And because of that, it was really easy for the Treasury to answer his request because they knew what information they were looking for and what information they weren't going to include. On the other hand, Libby here, she understands unlit walkways in Norfolk and Norwich, but when she asks for this information to the police, and the Norfolk Constabulary, can't say that word, they don't identify lit or unlit walkways. They probably have specific areas or specific roads, but they won't necessarily have any information on the lighting in those. So what it would have been better for Libby to do is specify exactly which walkway she was talking about, because she has this idea of what an unlit walkway in Norfolk and Norwich is. She would probably be able to say this road, this alleyway, this bridge, whatever it is. And if she'd given that information, the police in Norfolk would have probably been able to give her the information that she's asking for because they would have had statistics on incidents that have occurred in these particular places. So it's just about understanding that the way that we think about information might not be the way that it's recorded. And sometimes you might need to make an FOI request to find out how that information is recorded. And then you can go on to make the FOI request that you need to get the information, like the statistics you need. But first you might need to do like a phishing FOI request to understand, okay, like how do you record this information? How is it held at your authority? And the final one is defining a meaning of a term to them versus using a term that can be interpreted in many ways. So this is kind of similar to the last example, but slightly different. So paper, here's a great example of this, right? Paper can be interpreted in many, many different ways. And if you ask a local authority, like say you're doing some research into like paper wastage by local authorities because you want to show that it has like an environmental impact. And you ask you batch ask local authorities, like, how much paper do you waste each year? The local authority might come back and say, like, okay, well, what do you mean by paper? Like, do you mean printed out paper? Do you mean like hand towels? Do you mean toilet roll? Do you mean magazines or newspapers? Do you mean receipt rolls? Like, what do you mean by paper? And you might mean all of those things, but that is going to be, again, a really big request. And you might specifically be thinking like, oh, I meant printing. I meant like things that were printed out and then chucked away. So you can be really, really specific and define these terms. So the FOI officers can not have to look through so much information. So an example of this, which is quite good. So Edward here has specified, he's asking Bexhill Academy about incidents recorded in the school year. So he's also been specific about the date range, about pupils seriously assaulting other pupils. And this is one of those things like, well, what do you mean by serious assault? Because people might have different definitions of the term. So Edward has here defined what he personally means by serious assault so that he can get the information that he needs. So for him, serious assault is meant to cover any physical assault rather than just verbal abuse or generally threatening behavior. So he means something that has physically harmed people, whereas other people might consider serious assault to include verbal abuse or threatening behavior, which has meant that Bexhill Academy have been able to really quickly answer his FOI request and give him the information he needs. Courtney, on the other hand, again, looks like it's a request that is quite specific, quite well defined. But the problem here is she has asked for alcohol-related referrals. And what they actually want to know is, like, what do you mean by alcohol-related? So she has to define that term. Does she mean that, like, people who were drinking alcohol themselves, people who had come to A&E as a result of being assaulted by someone who had been drinking alcohol? Does she mean people who have like hurt themselves on things containing alcohol? Like, you know, there's a lot of different ways that this could be interpreted by the NHS. So they're asking her to clarify, quite rightly, what she means. And that's just one thing you need to kind of keep in mind, is like, be specific about what you mean when you're thinking about making a request. So this is the thing that we're going to need to do together. Let's go ahead and write a request. Right, bear with me a little bit because I've got to stop being on this presentation share and try and get on to what do they know. If you have a request theme or a request topic that you want to make, please drop it into the chat now. And Myth and Helen and Gemma can speak up and let me know what we could make a request on. Hopefully that has come off, and hopefully you can now see what do they know. Can you see what do they know?
Yep. Yeah.
Perfect. So, does anyone have a request that they would like to make? Please feel free to raise your hand or speak up.
Everybody's on mute at the moment, but Jake has said he wants to find out the gap between what was owed and what was recovered by HMRC in civil tax settlements.
Okie dokie.
In the chat.
Right. Let us start to make that request. Right, so I'm logged into What Do They Know here, and we're going to go through these steps together. That was the homepage you just saw. I clicked on make a request. It's once you're logged in, it's really easy. So we were thinking about which authority did Jake want to make that to? Jake, do you want to unmute yourself so you can talk as well? If that's possible. I think it should be.
It should be.
I was just struggling to unmute then. It's to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, HMRC.
Okay.
Or His Majesty, I guess now.
So let's search for HMRC and see what we can find on What Do They Know. Okay. HM Revenue and Customs. So one of the first things you can do is click on the name of the authority and just double check that the request hasn't already been made and the information isn't already out there. We have over 1 million requests on What Do They Know? So it's a huge database of information. So there is a likelihood that the request could have already been made. But let's go and have a look. What were we asking for, Jake? What information did you want?
It's to find out what the gap is between what was owed to HMRC in tax and what they have recovered in civil settlements. And the context of that is that HMRC has power to take companies and individuals to court, but don't do that, and they primarily settle civilly to avoid costs of court.
I can't see anything on this at the moment, so let's go ahead and make a request. Okay, so we've just been through a lot of information about how to make a request that we hopefully will get answered relatively quickly. And Jake, don't worry, like you'll be able to easily follow along with this request, even though I'm making it, and I can send out notifications when we get information back as well. So firstly, we need to think of a, sorry about my chair. We need to think of a summary about the information that we are going to be requesting. So we are going to request information about the gap between, so there is, but that's in 2018. So that's quite a while ago. Collection of tax not received. So gap between tax owed and tax recovered via civil means. Civil settlements, you said, didn't you?
Yeah, and I guess to refine it, so obviously there's individuals and companies, maybe it could be like corporation tax.
Okay, so that is really good. So what are we going to write? We are going to write, I would like to request information about, so when you say the gap between, you literally mean, like to them, you mean like what is owed to HMRC?
So in a sense of like company X owes a corporation tax bill of, like, let's just say £50 million. They're a large company and they have that outstanding balance for a while. HMRC could prosecute to recover, try and recover it, or they could settle with the company for, let's say, 30 million to get a good chunk of that money in, but avoid having to pay costs in court and extend like a lengthy legal process that they might not win.
Okay.
So yeah, trying to find out what the gap is between what would originally be owed and like kind of what they're writing off.
Okay. So I guess we would probably want to ask, I'd like to request information about the difference between, oh, I'm sorry, I learn how to spell, between what is owed to HMRC in corporation tax, and what is paid in settlements with corporations. Like, do we have any specific corporation types that we're looking for?
No. But like the time frame as well could be from 2017. So that's when they had the legal powers in order to prosecute.
Okay, so from 2017 to now?
Yeah.
That's quite a lot of information that you're asking for. Would you want that broken down?
It can be. I'm happy for you to instruct on the best way in which we could get this.
So I would probably say you'd want it broken down by financial year, because they'll be going from financial year to financial year. You also might want to start off with just one particular financial year to find out how much information you actually get back from them, because 2017 to now is what, 7 years, and there's probably quite a lot of companies that owe corporation tax to HMRC or are like pay corporation tax to HMRC, so that's going to be quite a lot of records to go through. That's kind of why I was asking also whether like you're looking at specific corporation sizes, for example. Like, are you thinking like corporations with over like 1,000 employees? Or
yeah, let's go for that, and maybe for the most recent full financial year.
Okay. So that would be 2022 to 2023, wouldn't it? Because we're not currently in the 2023 to 24. 2022 to 2023 financial year. And for corporations of over 1,000 employees. This is where I call out to my colleague Helen and say, is there anything else we need to think about, Helen?
No, I think that looks good.
Should we be thinking about specific format? Like, do you want this information in a specific format, like Excel spreadsheets, or although we hate spreadsheets here, but like, are you looking for that? How are you going to use the information? Like, do you want it to be searchable for you, or like, would you be happy to get it in a PDF document with just lists of names and amounts?
Excel format would be better for searching. And Chris in the chat has just made a seemingly very useful comment about choosing an earlier year.
Okay. Yep.
Because the tax liability would have been due in December 23. So maybe do the previous financial year, 21 to 22.
Okay, perfect. 21 to 22. You see, I don't know much about corporation tax, I have to say, so that is very useful. So ideally we'd like this in spreadsheet format. Yeah, so let's leave that there. Do you know anything else about the data which might help us direct the FOI officers? Like, for example, do you know how they normally output information like this? Have you asked for anything like this previously?
No.
No? Okay. So if that's good to go, Helen, shall I send this one across?
Maybe instead of saying we're looking at, say, word it in a way that makes it clear that that's the actual information that you're requesting.
Okay, right. See, this is why Helen is around. We would like information from the 2021 to 2022 financial year and for corporations of over 1,000 employees. Do we also want to specify that they're based in the UK? Those are probably the only ones that HMRC are relevant to. They don't deal with overseas corporations at all.
I mean, I imagine it would just be settling with UK divisions rather. So I presume that means that they would be based in the UK if it is a division. I think this is probably great.
Yeah, let's go with this and see what we get back. So next thing we do is preview our request. Okay. So this just basically gives us a chance to have a look at like what we've written and go like, is that actually what I want? Is that going to give me the information? Have I put in everything I need to think about? So we have done things like we have set a date range. We have specified what type of corporation we're looking at. We have said what information we want. So the difference between what is owed to HMRC in corporation tax as opposed to any other kind of tax and what is paid in settlements to them. I don't know whether we should define the term settlement. It may be something that they understand. It could be quite a specific term to them. If we think it's something that we might need to define because they might think about it in some way differently, then now is the time to shout up and say HMRC could define settlement as something or something. So we should say the settlement is this. No, that's cool. In which case, and we've also said what format we'd like the information in. So we would like this in a spreadsheet format. In which case, let's go through and send and publish this request. Okay. Easy as that. It's been sent. So now HMRC have 20 working days to respond to us with information or request a clarification. I will let you know what information we get back. I'll update you guys when we get a response, all of you, via email. Thanks so much. We will reconvene at 11 for rejections and exemptions. Okay. Oh, and that does not want to, not clicked on there. There we go. So let's walk through the possible outcomes for our FOI request. The first and most depressing outcome is the no response outcome. So if after 20 days, the authority has not responded, we will need to give them a nudge. This is the first point of call before you do anything else, is just remind them that you put the FOI request in. You can do this through What Do They Know. If you sent the request through What Do They Know, you can just add it to the thread and it will send it automatically to them. And just say like, hi, it's been 20 days. I'm still waiting for my information. Hopefully that should kick them into gear and they will respond to you. But if they don't, then you can report them to the ICO and the ICO will get on their case for being non-responsive. Or if something's changed during the 20 days that we've been waiting, because that's 20 working days, not 20 days. So like it doesn't include weekends. And we decide we don't actually need the information anymore, or it might not be that useful in the public domain, we can actually withdraw the request. And if we do decide that information isn't needed and like we don't think it's going to be particularly useful to the general public, we should withdraw the request so that the FOI team are not continuing to work on gathering that information. So we're not creating work for them that we don't care about anymore. But let's hope that we don't get no response. So the other possible outcome is that we get a response. Now, legally, they have to confirm or deny whether they hold the information. But but the response can come in a lot of different ways. So in the best case scenario, we'd have had the information released to us with no clarifications required, and after 20 days, or even hopefully slightly earlier, because 20 days is the outside limit, the authority will have come back to us and said, hey, yes, thank you for your wonderful FOI request. They will never say that. And they will just give us the information that we've asked for. The next best case scenario is that they've asked us to clarify something. I'm going to go through clarifications in a bit more depth over the next few slides. So we'll leave that one here for now. Sometimes they might respond and say that they're performing a public interest test. So I'll talk about what a public interest test is as well in a couple of slides. But just know that though the ICO recommends that it should only take 20 working days to perform a public interest test in normal circumstances, in reality, the law does not set a time limit on this at all. And then the last outcome is that we get a rejection, which is the one that we do not want, but we will go through what happens and what the possible rejections are in a little bit. So let's talk about clarifications. Some things you do need to know about clarifications. They reset the clock for another 20 days. So you've had 20 days that you've waited after you've put in your FOI request the first time round, and then they come back and say, oh, we want you to clarify this term. Like with the alcohol related one, like the NHS came back and said, we want you to clarify what you mean by alcohol related. That starts your clock again. So it's essentially 4 working weeks to get your first response, which is almost a month, like almost a calendar month. And then once you've had a clarification and you respond to that clarification, the clock starts again. You've got another 4 working weeks for them to respond. This is why the whole process to get a substantive response to your FOI can sometimes feel really long. So if you know about the research that we did really recently, one of the things that came up quite a lot in that research was the fact that the whole process of making FOIs feels like it's too long. And if you are trying to change policy or doing a campaign, you need to be able to move quickly and get the information that you need promptly. And if they ask for clarifications, that is making you delayed. And that means that you might not have the information you need to build that policy or to do that campaign, which is kind of one of the reasons why we did the first presentation. Like, we want to help people make requests that don't get a huge amount of clarifications. The most common reason that we see that people are asked to clarify requests because they've not stated what time frame they're wanting the information for. So, you know, we talked about the calendar year, the financial year, the school year, the other kind of like time box periods that you might get. That's why, because this is one of the most common reasons that we see that people are asked to clarify. The other one is that the authority has a different interpretation of the thing you're asking for. So again, those request examples that we went through before the break, where we were showing the definition of term to you versus like giving a broad term that the authority might define in lots of different ways. This is why, because it's another thing that we see happens quite often that people are asked for clarifications about. So public interest tests. You might be told that the authority is performing a public interest test. Let's have a look. Public interest test. The sentence on the slide, I momentarily forgot what that was called. The sentence on the slide is a short and sweet explanation of what a public interest test is. Basically, it's a test to weigh up the public benefits of releasing information versus arguments against releasing information. Some authorities include the public interest test as part of their rejection. So, for example, I recently did an FOI request to Brighton and Hove Council about a consultation to reduce pupil numbers in the city. And when they rejected my request on the grounds that they were going to release the information at a later date themselves, they also included the information about the public interest test that they'd done about whether they should release the information in response to my request or just publish it when they were planning on publishing it. So let's talk a little bit about, oh wait, hang on. I should mention something quickly about public interest tests. So there are different kinds of exemptions, and some of them are subject to public interest tests. So I think about 17 of them are, but for some exemptions, the decision is considered to be absolute, and that means generally, there are exceptions, these are not subject to a public interest test to decide if the information should be released. Like I said, there are exceptions to this because there are exceptions to everything. So the absolute decision applies to 8 of the 25 exemptions. And the most common absolute exemption that you'll see in the wild, so the ones that won't be subject to a public interest test, are section 21, which is information that is already in the public domain. It's because it's already out there. They may then signpost you to it, or they may expect you to go and find it themselves. It depends how helpful they're feeling. Or a section 12 exemption, which is that the cost limit would be exceeded. So, you know, prior to the break, I was talking about like broad requests might be rejected because you're asking for so much information. So when Jake and I were going through, I said, if you ask for 2017 to now, that's like 7 years worth of information you're asking for. And being broad about the term, it's more likely then that they'll say, oh, it'll cost us too much to find this information, so we're going to reject this request and not give you any information at all. So that's one that we see quite often, and they don't subject that to a public interest test because the fact is that there is a limit to the amount of cost that authority has to bear by answering an FOI request. And if they say that this is exceeded, then they don't have to perform the public interest test. So let's move on then to the kind of rejection responses that you might receive. Great way to spend a Wednesday just before lunch. What happens if we receive a rejection? So one reason that a request is rejected, I can't speak. I have a sip of tea and then I'll try this again. One reason that a request is rejected is that the information is not held. So legally, like I said before, the authority has to confirm if they do or do not hold the information that you are looking for. If you know that there should be recorded information about the thing that you're asking for somewhere, then there are a couple of things that you can do. So one of those is digging a bit deeper with research and then resubmitting the request. Another one is asking for an internal review. We're going to go through the internal review process in a moment. Maybe there is no recorded information about this topic, which is why they don't hold the information. Or, as Helen said in response to one of the questions, someone else might hold the information. So you can try asking the FOI team to pass your request along if they know who holds the information, or tell you who might hold the information so that you can ask yourself and make the request to them instead. So there are a few different routes. Information not held is not like, okay, that's it, you can't do anything about it. There are a few things that you can do to still try and get that information. If the information is held, then we will have received a rejection based on an exemption clause. I will show you a slide with a list of all the exemptions on them in a moment. And then I will send you more information that you can look at your leisure so that you can go through all the different exemptions if you so please and figure out what they all relate to and how you can challenge them. But first, let's look at what we can do. Our first route, and the one which we'd almost always advise, and the one that I still need to do for the rejection that I got, is to ask for an internal review. So an internal review is just asking the FOI team to look at the decision-making process that led to the rejection of the FOI and reconsider if that decision was valid. If that decision wasn't valid, maybe the information could be released. It's really, really easy to ask for an internal review via what do they know. And actually, what do they know guides you through the steps. So if you get a rejection and on what do they know, you go into your request and you say, this request has been rejected when you clarify it, then what do they know comes up with a section of questions. You answer the questions, it's usually yes or no, and then it'll give you some information about what you can do in each different circumstance to challenge the rejection that you've got. I know what one question might be about this because it feels like the term internal review is like, oh my God, that's going to be a horrible, horrendous, long process, and it's going to take up a lot of my time. So how do I know if it's worth making the effort to put in an internal review? We did some research and I think it was 2019, and we found out that about 50% of refusals from particularly local councils get overturned at the internal review stage. So that means that like you'll get a rejection from the council, you ask for an internal review, you state like why you want the internal review, and the council goes, oh yeah, no, we shouldn't have rejected that. Okay, fine, here's the information. And though you can submit an internal review request without providing a reason in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and that's very important, you can only do that in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, we would usually recommend laying out your arguments for why you think the review is justified, because this helps the FOI officers make a decision. If you just submit a blank thing saying, I'd like an internal review, please, they'll go, okay, well, why do you think you need one? And then if they haven't got that kind of information as to why you think that your FOI request have been rejected, then it'll be harder for them to make a decision, and they'll have to go back through lots of like basically more information and try and figure out why they think that you're asking for an internal review. Again, they can't read your mind, so helping them along is always useful. A note about environmental information regulations. You have 40 working days to complain. So that's basically asking for an internal review. And after this point, they don't have to respond to your complaint. And they also have a time limit. So they have 40 working days to respond to the internal review. It is different in Scotland. I will go through Scotland in a moment because Scotland is a devolved law, and so they have their own bits and pieces. So what might be the outcomes of the internal review? Did I do a specific slide? I did. So the outcomes of the internal review will be, your information is released, the exemption has been overturned. This is what we want. But what we might get instead is the exemption is partially overturned. So some of the information is released. This is still a win. It might mean that some of the information is sensitive and can't be released, but you've still got some of it. So that is still a win. And you might be able to find out the rest of it by asking in a different way or by being specific about some things. And then the worst case scenario is that the exemption is upheld and no information is released. That would be sad. Okay, so let's move on to the possible reasons for an exemption. Right, this is like a slide with a lot of information on it, which is why I said previously, I'm going to send you an email after this with a bunch of links to help pages that you can refer to if you receive any of these rejections. And as with everything, if you are using what do they know for any of this, and you get a rejection and you think, I don't know how this works, we have an amazingly dedicated team of volunteers who provide people with all kinds of help relating to FOI requests. So you can drop them a line and they will be able to talk to you about this. I took this list from FOI Wiki, but on the What Do They Know help pages, they do have a list of exemptions as well, but they've got like explanations of each of the exemptions, and it would not fit on one slide. So this is why this has come from What Do They Know Wiki. There are 2 other section exemptions that refusals can come from that aren't technically exemptions. So section 14, which is vexatious and repeated requests. And if you are doing that thing that Jake asked about prior to us going on break, which is like making a request for information that's already been released. If it's a lot of them to the same authority in a time frame, that can be considered, like in a small, really short time frame, that could sometimes be considered vexatious. It could also be lumped together and hit the cost limit. So just need to be a little bit aware. If you're sending multiple requests to the same authority, they might start to consider that vexatious, and then they'll slap a section 14 on it and not answer you. And section 8 is about providing information from yourself. And this is usually around providing a name on the request. So this is one thing that it might be useful for you to know if you are requesting under an organizational name. Sometimes authorities like to have a person name, not just an organization name on the request. And you don't have to give your full name. You can just give an initial and your last name, or just your last name, like you saw when or just your first name, sorry. You saw when I put in the request, I just put Jen down. Like, you don't have to give your full name, but they do want a person name associated often, rather than just an organizational name. Okay. Oh. So I want to quickly talk about what I sort of went into a little bit just now, which is absolute or qualified in exemptions. Another sip of tea so I can talk properly. So exemptions under FOI can be absolute or qualified. Qualified exemptions are the one where the authority is required to carry out a public interest test if they are saying that they're applying an exemption and not releasing the information. Qualified exemptions can then be broken down into 2 categories. They can be prejudice-based exemptions and class-based exemptions. Class-based exemptions are those that allow the authority to withhold information without having to demonstrate that releasing the information would cause harm. Prejudice-based exemptions, on the other hand, require the authority to demonstrate that the release of the information would be prejudicial. I can't say that word. For example, like ongoing court proceedings. Releasing information about those would prejudice the jury, therefore they can't do that. So this is where the prejudice test comes in. To rely on some exemptions, the authority has to show that the release of information would cause the harm that the exemption is designed to prevent. This is called a prejudice test. The prejudice has to be real, and it is necessary to demonstrate a causal link between the release of the information and the harm arising from that release of information. There also has to be a greater likelihood that harm arises than it doesn't on the release of the information. I hope that was clear, because this is kind of like one of those quite complex things about the FOI law and about exemptions and how they're applied. But again, I will send out information after this presentation, after this seminar, so you'll be able to read through it and try and understand it at your leisure. Right, so a quick note about Scotland. I don't know if we have anyone here that is based in Scotland or that is trying to affect policy making in Scotland or run campaigns in Scotland, but you do need to know a few things about Scotland because Scottish law is devolved. So this means that the Scottish government have made their own specific points of law around freedom of information and environmental information regulations. And they have their own information commissioner as well. So they don't use the ICO. They have their own Scottish version of the ICO. If you are doing comparative research or wanting to specifically affect policymaking for a devolved responsibility, it is worth taking a look at the help page on What Do They Know, which covers Scottish law. I will send that out. The key points to remember are that the law is different, which means that the objective exemptions are different. And if you want to ask for an internal review for a Scottish authority, by law, you have to provide a reason for the internal review request. So like I said before, in England, Northern Ireland and Wales, you don't have to provide a reason, but it's best practice too. But in Scotland, by law, you have to provide a reason that you're asking for the internal review. And also, if you've asked for information from the Scottish Information Commissioner, then you can't appeal. You can't make an appeal to the Scottish Information Commissioner. So, for example, if there's been a rejection, if the Scottish Information Commissioner have rejected your request, you can't appeal to them. You have to take it straight to court because they can't appeal the decision themselves. For environmental information regulations in Scotland as well, you also need to ask for a review no later than 40 working days after the date that you receive the response. So this is slightly different as well, or 60 working days after you made the request. Whereas we have 40 working days just for the response. They also say you can 60 working days after you made the request is the limit. After that point, they don't have to respond to you. Okay. Yeah, Scotland is always fun and challenging. However, we have looked at it and sometimes their FOI law is a little bit better. Or the way it's applied, sorry. So, what happens if your internal review is rejected? So this is where things start to come off. What do they know for the moment? As your next step is taking the decision to the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. So you can do this in a couple of ways. So you can do this by filling in a form, or you can do it by sending an email to their specific review address. There are help pages on the ICO which go through this, and we are at the moment trying to, well, not at the moment, but it is in our long-term plan to try and get some of this internal review, like decision-making process past the internal review onto What Do They Know. I'm not sure if I was very clear when I said that, sorry. So you'll need to decide if you want to do this, if you want to refer something to the ICO after your internal review has been rejected, and then you need to read and follow the guidance from the ICO. If you do get to this point, What Do They Know has a help page on this, which I can send you out afterwards. And the ICO also has a lot of guidance on their own website about this. Sometimes the ICO can rule in your favor. So they will go through, they will look at the decision the authority has made. They will look at the arguments that you've made as to why the information should be released, because you will have to do that as part of the referral to the ICO. But then the authority still doesn't release the information. So then you have to keep in contact with both the ICO and the authority, and you need to ask the ICO to push the authority to release the information. The ICO aren't under an obligation to do this, but if the authority fails to comply with an ICO, I think it's decision notice, then they may be in contempt of court. So then the ICO has to pursue this. So then your first step as a requester is to contact the ICO and let them know that you've still not had a response to the decision notice. And all of the decision notices have deadlines for compliance and for appeal, and they're set out in those notices. This can be quite a tricky process. So if you do get to this point and you want to pursue something, do get in touch with us, because like I said, our volunteers have a wealth of knowledge and have been through this process themselves a number of times. It doesn't always mean that it's going to be successful, but it can be a useful thing to go through if you feel that the information that you are asking for is worth it to you, and you want to go through that process. And then what happens? What what happens if the ICO don't rule in your favour? Then after the ICO is a tribunal. In England, Wales and Northern Ireland, you have to set out why you disagree with the decision of the ICO to be able to take things to tribunal. The best thing to do if you're considering this, specifically, like for both things, but also definitely for tribunals, is really get in touch with us, because we'll probably need to provide quite specific advice to you. And the volunteers will probably have some information for you that will help in setting out why you disagree and like how to go through the process as well.